Good afternoon and a very warm welcome from the GIMS team to our online In Conversation event. We're really delighted to have you here today. Also, an especially warm welcome to GIMS Associate Member Phil Armstrong and our guest Ndongo Samba. Ndongo is currently a research and program manager at the West Africa office of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Dakar, and his work focuses on fair trade, labour markets in developing countries, and economic and monetary sovereignty. Now, time has flown by so quickly since our last event in July 2021, when I talked in my introduction of a world that was hopefully beginning to restore some sort of approximation of normal after 2 exceedingly difficult years. Of course, even before the pandemic began, things were far from normal. Rising poverty and inequality, along with the existing and growing disparity in wealth between the global north and south, were the phenomena of decades. However, the human hope for a restoration of some semblance of stability has not occurred. And it's like we have jumped from the frying pan right into the fire. The global pandemic, along with the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, has interrupted our lives in ways we could not have possibly imagined. It has created increased economic and social instability worldwide, adding to that which already existed. The interruption to global supply chains, an over-reliance on external markets, and just-in-time manufacturing have demonstrated in a way that no other could, the fragility of our existence, how easy it is to descend into chaos. And yet, instead of admitting that we need to address with urgency the clearly destructive nature of the current economic paradigm, the collective West seems determined to restore the business as usual sign to the door. And yet, still, the biggest challenge remains before us, one that is starting to impact on many developed countries around the world, while at the same time adding to the huge destruction already suffered by many in the global south, creating further poverty and inequality. Now, you may have guessed what I'm talking about, and that's the climate crisis. A crisis which now seems to have been relegated to the back burner in the UK, as we have recently seen as the government clutches at any straw available to find solutions for the energy crisis, whilst at the same time advocating growth at any cost and abandoning any pretense of being green. The price that we will all pay will be a high one. Up to now, the Western we can have it all society has been both at the expense of working people in the global north, as well as those in the global south, whether that is through exploitation of land and resources, the indebting of poorer nations, and bailouts dependent on selling off and of private and privatizing public assets. Whilst the Gower Initiative was founded with an objective to bring awareness of how government spends to the UK audience, it has become increasingly clear that the domestic context is just one part of the picture. Given the events of the past few years and the tectonic shifts in geopolitical power that are currently taking place, the GIMS team are really keen to bring a deeper awareness to Western audiences of the challenges faced by the global South, which have their roots in colonial and neocolonial exploitation by Western powers, and how they might be resolved using an MMT framework. If the current situation has shown humanity only one thing, it is that our fate depends on our collective imagination and the ability of sovereign nations to work together in the spirit of friendship and cooperation. Whether it's how we address the vast inequities which the current economic paradigm has provoked to the detriment of citizens in both global North and South, creating an international framework for trading more fairly and enabling sustainable economic development domestically, or working together to construct the basis for further progress that will respect ecological boundaries. And these are the challenges we face. So without further ado, let me hand you over to Ndongo and Phil for what I know will be both an informative and stimulating conversation. Welcome to you both, and thank you.
Thanks, Prue, for a great introduction, as always, and it's a great pleasure to be working with the GIMS again, and especially so because we have Ndongo with us today. Thanks, Ndongo, for coming.
Thanks, Phil, for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here among all of you.
Yeah, and basically what I like to do at the start of the interview, and you can go into as much detail as you want. You know, sometimes people I ask this question still talking after 20 minutes. That's absolutely fine. Or you might have a briefer answer, whichever you went. But what's kind of your MMT story? You know, your story in economics. How did you come across MMT? You know, everyone's very interested to know how individuals, you know, have that have their eyes opened, if you like, to the insights of MMT.
Like, I think it's 2017, I was in Brussels for a trip with one of my colleagues, Mahab Ben Gada. She's Tunisian and she works for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, the Tunis office. And we were talking about heterodox economics, monetary sovereignty, and so on. And she told me, as you are working on the CFA franc and you are interested in monetary sovereignty, probably you should have a look at MMT. So she gave me that advice because until then I never heard of MMT. And let's say some months later, I started to read a bit, MMT blogs, etc., to have an idea about what is MMT. And well, I was, happily surprised to stumble across this framework because it resonates in me. It resonates in the sense that I was working on monetary sovereignty for West Africa. For the Francophone countries. And until then, I did not find a theoretical tradition saying that monetary sovereignty is important. Because I have a background in development economics. Dependency theory, theories of imperialism, and so on. And even in that kind of radical framework, heterodox framework, you would not see this focus on monetary sovereignty. So for me, it was really a nice surprise to find this framework, MMT. And for me, it explains a lot, especially if you want to understand the monetary and fiscal dimensions of colonialism. Well, you cannot find a better research program than MMT. So that was my initial journey with MMT. I would not say that I grasped MMT when I started to co-write a book on the CFA franc, because it was my initial journey towards MMT. But I think after I finished writing this book and after reading more academic papers, I started to grasp a bit better MMT.
Yeah, and I've not heard of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, Ndongo. I'm a fan of Rosa Luxemburg, and I like putting her quotes on my wall in my classroom, you know, all the classics you can imagine. So just let everyone know a little bit about what the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation does, and maybe, I don't know how aware your colleagues might be about MMT there. So what's the aim of the foundation? Does MMT come into it at all, more broadly?
Yeah, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation is not from Luxembourg, the country.
yeah.
Because many people think that it's from Luxembourg. No, it's BURG. There's no O in it.
Yeah.
And it's named after a German revolutionary, Rosa Luxemburg. She was, I mean, a Marxist terrorist, and she was born in Poland. And, you know, in the German political system, every political party could create its own foundation, granted that they, I mean, they record some electoral performance over a given period. And the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, I think, has been created in the beginning of the 2000s, and we have something like 24, 25 offices around the world, regional offices. So I work for the Dakar office, which has been created in 2010-11. And yeah, I worked there since 2012. And basically, German foundations are political foundations in the sense that they are doing political education work. In Dakar, for example, we are working with trade unions, civil society organizations, progressive intellectuals, peasant movements, etc. And we are trying to support them financially in their projects in a way to enhance, a progressive agenda. Normally, we would say in the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation that we are committed to democratic socialism, meaning that, well, not a kind of authoritarian socialism, but a kind of society where the economy is controlled by people, where you would find equality. There is a famous, quote by Rosa Luxemburg saying that when you have liberty without equality, it's a kind of it's a kind of a tyranny. You see, when you have equality without liberty, it's also a kind of tyranny. So you need equality, liberty, and also solidarity, because solidarity is what allows, the coexistence of liberty and equality. And so the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation is an internationalist, foundation. And regarding MMT, in 2019, we organized, a conference called the African Economic and Monetary Sovereignty Conference. It was in Tunis with my colleague Maha Ben Gada and a German colleague Kai Kodenbrock, and also Fadel Kaboub, from Denison University. Yeah. And yeah, we try to push for monetary sovereignty, economic sovereignty in Africa using that MMT lens. And I think the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation generally has been very favorable to disseminating ideas inspired by the MMT approach. And also there are some papers on MMT, not academic papers, but more like opinion pieces, interviews on MMT, produced by Fadel Kaboub, myself, and others, published by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. And this year also in Dakar, we'll have the second edition of this conference, African Economic Monetary Sovereignty. And we'll also have some MMT perspectives regarding the climate crisis.
It's great to know, to learn a little about the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and that, MMT is something that you're bringing into your work. In terms of your work, Ndongo, how you build a body of work. I mean, just let everyone know what your primary focus, what you're aiming to achieve with your work individually and maybe with other scholars, and just let us, I think Prue used the phrase, filling in that knowledge gap, because over in England we know there's been a big real resource transfer for many years from the global south to the global north, but we don't know much about the details that you're doing. So really it's two parts. Just go into as much detail as you want to, tell us about your work, and then what sort of ideas, visions, policies you might put forward to maybe redress this resource shift, which from our perspective it's gone the wrong way. Resources should be going the other way, not from south to north. So thanks, Ndongo. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Phil, for this question. I must say at the beginning that, I wasn't trained initially as, specialist of monetary issues, financial issues, because I started during my studies, my PhD, and a bit after that, I was more interested in employment issues because I have always been fascinated by employment because we live in a societies organized around employment. So my thinking was how people could cope if they don't have access to decent employment. And in the developing countries, you have you have huge challenges in the sense that, well, you have strong demographic growth, economic growth does not create decent jobs and so on. And you don't have, a developed manufacturing sector for most countries. So there are particular challenges, you see. So how could you have, a development model that would allow people to have access to decent jobs? I have been always fascinated by this issue. And afterwards, I would come to the, monetary and financial aspects through my work on the CFA franc, which is, a colonial currency born during colonial time and still circulating in Francophone African countries, majoritarily, and with the same principles laid during the colonial period. So what could we do in a way to address this issue of resource transfers? Well, there have been a number of proposals, but the thing is there are two issues. The first is the realism of those proposals, given the nature of the, global system, in the sense that, well, since the 1960s, with the independencies in Africa, Asia, etc., the third world, now called the global south, has been making some proposals to to reform the global economic, monetary, and financial system. But every time, well, the global north would counteract to say that we don't want to reform the system. And the thing is it really reasonable to think that we could achieve something progressive within this global system? This is a first question, and I raise it in a way which is not dogmatic. I am just raising this question: are we not naive, thinking that we could change something by addressing demands to the global North leaders, the G7 countries, G8, G20? Can we expect change by addressing, rational proposals to those, countries, governments, etc.? Because the thing is, in the mid-1970s, there was this call for the new international economic order. There had been very progressive proposals, for example, having better prices for global South raw materials, having technology transfers, public external debt cancellation, all those things. We had that better access also to northern markets. But, well, the global North said, we are not interested. And in the 1980s, we had structural adjustment plan, and the results were lost decades. We had recently, the COVID pandemic. We have the consequences of the Russian aggression of Ukraine, etc. And we see that the global North, doesn't understand the global challenges we face, in the global South. So for me, all of these elements show that, well, we should not be too optimistic about having, let's say, a positive response from the global North. So that is the first aspect. But people could challenge that, saying that through activism, we could change things. And I would like to see that. I am really for that. The second aspect is that, well, even if the global North would, say, accept some of the proposals made by the global South, this would not be enough, because the global South countries themselves have to change their countries, their societies, their forms of government. So that is a thing, because these resource transfers are a fundamental aspect of economic imperialism. But this pattern of economic imperialism would not happen without a particular class structure. I mean, for example, you have governments, you have elites that are in objective alliances with northern transnationals, Chinese transnationals, to maintain the same economic model. So as long as there is not significant change for another type of economic development that would be equalitarian, that would be ecologically friendly, I mean, even the most progressive, reforms would be limited by this particular class structure. So that is the thing. So I mean that whatever the state of the global system, there are changes that are needed in the global south. And when global south leaders go, for example, abroad, say that we want this or that, sometimes they do not make adequate changes within their countries. And I could take one example. It's the case of Senegal, my country, because the head of our government, President Macky Sall, he is the president of the African Union, because it's a rotating system. He went to see Putin, Vladimir Putin, some months ago, to say to Putin, you see, Africa risks starvation because, well, if you do not liberate the ports of Ukraine, we will not have access to the cereals produced by Ukraine, and this will be mass starvation in Africa, you see. But the thing is, in our countries, most of the labor force is in the agricultural sector. What have they done so that we are in a situation of food dependency? Because we have everything, I mean locally, we have everything. We have the land, we have the workers, we have the know-how to become food self-sufficient. But yet we did not take the adequate policies because we were following the World Bank and the IMF, because the World Bank says, well, you have to have food security, food sovereignty. I don't know what that means. Food security means if you have the foreign exchange to buy your imports, it's fine, it's better. It's comparative advantage, and you do other things. You don't need to have, you know, and they were following that policies, free trade, and they destroyed agriculture. And now they go to Russia to say that if you don't liberate the ports, we'll have mass starvation. So you see, there are reforms needed inside the global south. And this is not to say that imperialism is not a driving force. We have imperialism. We are under imperialism. But the thing is, if you want to address imperialism, you have to build a social bloc that will address it and that will propose an alternative to the current model.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many questions. I agree absolutely that in a sense, neoliberalism since 1980 has increased inequality within countries to, you know, going back 100 years, and also between countries, as you'll know. And obviously we're all in the same sort of group wanting to shift neoliberalism to a more enlightened, democratic, socialist founded type of structure with hopefully an MMT understanding of how the monetary system works. And that absolutely makes sense that within the current system, it's very difficult and we need systemic change. But interesting when you mention like Africa, for example, or the global south, that they need to change themselves as well. And obviously mentioned Senegal, maybe has followed the World Bank or the sort of Washington consensus model, etc., which, you know, isn't the right way. But I don't know much about the global south, like individual places. This might not exist, but from your point of view, Ndongo, is there any particular country or any particular, if you like, groups within countries who are trying to do things the right way, the way that you would consider to be the right way, you know? So are there any parts of, say, Africa, you could look at other parts of the global south, where you see sort of glimmers of hope, lights going on a bit for, you know, maybe rejecting neoliberalism, maybe trying to do things the way perhaps yourself and Fadel have said about aiming more for food sovereignty rather than trying to buy it all from foreign countries, etc.?
Well, it's really difficult to say because, well, the Washington consensus policies have been so dominant that even the well-meaning governments, often they are, I mean, under the intellectual domination of, let's say, the neoclassical myths about, you know, having low deficits, etc. It's not the role of the state to create jobs, but it's the role of the private sector. So it's really difficult to say. Probably in Latin America, I do not know the context well, but generally they have been much more progressive, I mean, leaders from the left in Latin America compared to Africa. In Francophone countries in Africa, I would say you could not give any example of a country doing the right things, because unfortunately, most of them are still under the, I mean, informal control of France. Really, they are, well, I would say they are still in a kind of neo-colonial relationships. Myself, I know that there are some limits with the concept of neo-colonialism, to the extent that what it meant, I mean, from the 1960 to 2000 is now different, because now the colonizing power is not only the former metropole, but the colonizing power is capital in itself. So it's a colonizer without, I mean, a visible face. So the colonizer could be African capital in itself, you see. So it's really difficult to say, well, if we have a country doing good things along the way we would recommend, for example. Generally, people can quote Rwanda, because Rwanda, they lived a genocide in 1994. And yeah, it has been very difficult for them to recover from that. But they have been doing interesting economic progress. But the thing is, this economic progress also happened in a very special, I mean, context, because Rwanda has been profiting from the instability of the neighboring countries. And normally, as a Pan-Africanist, we would not like, I mean, African countries to benefit from the weaknesses of other African countries. And the thing is also, Rwanda is the poster child for the World Bank. I mean, all the reforms advocated by the World Bank, they would be number one, for example, in terms of what they call doing business, etc. You know, welcoming foreign direct investment, all of those things. And obviously also the regime is a highly centralized authoritarian regime, you know. So you have those kind of things. So you could not say that this is the right model. People also give the example of Ethiopia. It's a kind of old school, I mean, developmental state with a strong state, centralized state, and also well, domestic investment, I mean, dominated by state spending. I would say that there are interesting things regarding Ethiopia in the ways that the government cooperates with the central bank to I mean, to realize, I mean, development projects, etc. But still, there are many challenges, because they are not able to arrange to for example, tackle growing unemployment, etc. They are also in these patterns of attracting foreign investment for, I mean, low wage based, I mean, industrialization and so on. So you have many challenges everywhere. So it's really difficult to find a good model, and good models could not also be, I mean, identified through rates of economic growth, because economic growth in itself is not often a good indicator of genuine social progress.
Yeah, I might just take a question, Ndongo. It's come from Sarah. And what would you consider the impact in Africa of the push from the banks, financial institutions, pushing the kind of African politicians into the cashless economy, you know, with a more mobile digital framework? You know, because it's quite difficult, certainly in England, from my perspective, to understand exactly what this looks like on the ground in Africa, you know?
Well, there has been this push, but it has been an uneven, I mean, uneven development, in the sense that some regions, countries have been going much more quickly in that direction compared to others, for example. In East Africa, I think in Kenya, for example, there have been strong progress in terms of, digital inclusion of people, financial inclusion through digitalization, etc. Yeah, but I think the idea is just generally to create new forms of markets for the global finance, in the sense that most of those people are not financially included. They don't have a bank account, and banks are generally not interested in locating in rural areas or some neighborhoods for which there is no genuine demand. But through, the digital platforms, the fintech, etc., they could hope to reach those people and try to extract, more value from those people. I think this has been the basic motivation. And during the pandemic, there has been also one other argument in favor of this kind of move, in the sense that, well, if you are in a pandemic situation, people could not go to work, etc., but you have to reach them, because you have to provide some benefits so that they could spend, etc. So if they are not financially included, how could the state target them? And so there has been this new motivation, a new argument created by the pandemic. But I think that, well, there are some there could be some positive aspect to having people included financially, and even having the state having the possibility to target them, to give them interesting. But the thing is, all of these things have to be under democratic control, and I think everywhere that is the challenge.
Yeah, it sounds a bit of a mixed message, really, with it. Like you always get the sense there might be certain elements that are positive, but overall the motivation isn't right behind it. And these things are always quite complex. One thing I might ask about, I'm not familiar with like the extent to which groups in Africa particularly have tried to bring in the job guarantee in some sort of form. I mean, have you come across arguments with your colleagues about the job guarantee and how it might be applied in Africa? Because I'm thinking that I know a little about it was in the JEFS plan in Argentina, how successful it was there. But I've not really heard about it in the sense of Africa. Is there much of a movement towards people pushing for the job guarantee in any form in any African countries? What have you come across in that sense?
Well, I do not know programs that could be inspired by the idea of a job guarantee in Africa, but there have been some special initiatives aimed at providing jobs to some segments of the population. I think we have such kind of initiatives in Ghana, for example. In Senegal also recently, there have been some schemes to create limited employment opportunities for the young people. But the idea of having a real job guarantee, guaranteeing job to everyone ready for work, I mean, well, I could not think of any country trying to do that in Africa. And yet I think that is the way to go, because in Africa, for me, the most important challenge is creating decent jobs for the people. But the ways we could create decent jobs have to be different than what happened in the global north, for example. And this is due to, I mean, historical reasons, and yeah, because you see, economic growth itself does not create jobs. If you take again my country, Senegal, we had, for example, between 2012 and 2018, 6% average rate of GDP growth. Yet during that period, we did not create any jobs in net terms in the modern sector. So that means all of the job growth happened in the informal sector. So that means that the correlation between having more growth and having more decent jobs, you could not have that. I mean, this correlation is not always working. I mean, in developing countries, especially in Africa, because the sector that has been creating decent jobs in en masse is the manufacturing sector. And most African countries lack a manufacturing sector, or at least a developed manufacturing sector. And so that means that all of the jobs created when they are decent happened in the state or in the services controlled by the private sector. You see, so no jobs in the manufacturing sector. And so when you have policies inspired by the World Bank and the IMF that contributes to destroy the agricultural sector, to transform peasants into proletarians, while you'll have urban exodus, you'll have a growing informal sector, you know, and this is a challenge. That's why I think the idea of a job guarantee is a way to go. Why? Because companies in the capitalist system, their main objective is not to create jobs, but to make profits.
Yeah.
So they create jobs to the extent that they are making profits, you see.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in developing countries, well, the local private sector, well, is weak. Is weak because it is dominated by foreign capital, and it is not supported enough by the national government. So what happens is that this sector could not create jobs en masse. It's not possible. And if this sector wanted to create jobs, there's not enough demand, domestic demand. And you could not base your employment strategy, on exports, on having, markets abroad, because all countries could not be net exporters. Some have to be net importers. So you could not have a full employment strategy based on being a net exporter. That means that the jobs have to come inside. And for jobs to come inside, you have to have the appropriate demand conditions. And these demand conditions, you don't find them in developing countries. And the state has to step in to create that demand through public spending, but targeted public spending. And the job guarantee could be one way of creating, that kind of demand that would at least, ensure full employment, but at the same time create outlets for domestic companies. So that's why I think the job guarantee could be much more important, even in the developing countries, even more compared to the global north. So that is a very important, I think, instrument. But unfortunately, I have often seen governments and their officials say three things that, well, when you believe in those three things, you could not, tackle employment. The first thing is what they call employability. People are in employment because they lack employability. That is a nonsense, total nonsense. The second thing is that a good state should aspire to low deficits and even have budget surpluses, you see. And the third thing is that, well, it's the role of the private sector to create jobs, and the state has to just facilitate the private sector growth. If you subscribe to those three ideas, you cannot tackle the employment challenge. Unfortunately, we have to make more progress in terms of, raising awareness of the policymakers about the consequences of those assumptions.
Yeah, you won't be surprised to know, Ndongo, that we get the same three. People are unemployed, it's because they're no good. It's they've chosen to be in poverty, and the job guarantee always is take people as they are. So you've got to go, you'll know there's all this, fiscal prudence. Although obviously the current British government forgot about that apparently, but allegedly, governments are a household, you live within your means. So we have that, and of course the ideological thing that the private sector's the thing that creates everything, and the public sector is just like hangs on its coattails, So the only reason we can quote afford healthcare is because the private sector creates wealth in some sort of mystical fashion, which enables us to have a lot. Nobody really explains how. It's like, magic or something. We don't know the magic of the private sector. And that's very interesting you would say those three things, because we have the same problem in the north. We have to knock those out of the park. We have to take each one of those on, because it seems to me that perhaps even more in Africa, you do need a job guarantee, because if people have a decent job, stating the obvious for you yourself, you're there, it gives them that sense of security, takes them away from that precarious nature or economic precarious nature. So do you think there's any sorts of movements? Is there anything positive that we can kind of say to our audience in Africa or in the global south where people are mounting good answers to those three questions? You know, like if you like MMT based answers, you know, are people putting answers to these politicians? If they did, are they likely to listen? Do you think they're so enamored of the World Bank that it's impossible for them ever to listen?
I think there was a slight connection issue.
Yeah. Did you hear what I said, Ndongo?
Not the end, unfortunately.
I was just talking, you know, these three questions that they, you know, these problems that politicians, these three views, you know, managing state budgets, the unemployed deserve to be unemployed because they're not good enough, and our job is just to look after the private sector because, well, they're where all the wealth comes from, obviously. Is there any hope for people in Africa there? Are there people counteracting that? You know, what's the way forward, do you think, for the third world in dealing with those questions? Because I think you're absolutely right. Those are the questions that have to be confronted, and if you like, dealt with and answered and put to, I'm not saying it's easy, don't get me wrong, but is there any hope, do you think, that people are trying to answer those questions and put them to bed?
I think so, because most of the surveys I know of, generally employment ranks high among the priorities of the households. Yeah. How to create decent jobs for the people generally is the number one priority. Mm-hmm. And I mean, if the trade unions, peasant movements, I mean, youth employed associations, etc., they are I mean, sensitized about the idea of a job guarantee, mm-hmm. Sensitized about the way the monetary system works, I think we could be hopeful of genuine change. I think so. And well, myself, I am starting to try to do some efforts in that direction to make people understand how the monetary system works, the idea of a job guarantee, and why it is an important pillar, an important instrument of economic development. My opinion is that, well, the day ordinary people understand what is money, how the monetary system works, will have the genuine revolution, I think. Because, for example, you would not be able to explain to people in their villages why they do not have access, I mean, to safe water, why they do not have access to schools, etc. Because if you explain to them whatever is possible from a technical and material point of view could be financed in the domestic currency, well, I mean, that would open a new horizon of struggle, a new horizon of emancipation. And you see, there are a lot of creativity in people, in ordinary people. Often what happens is that they have been alienated by elite discourses saying that, well, we don't have the money has to come from abroad. If we don't have Japanese technology, or I mean French technology, we could not build schools, we could not build hospitals, etc. We have this kind of lack of money. And that's why I think MMT is important, because we do not need to wait for the reform of the international non-system, you know, to create, I mean, decent living for the majority. It is possible, but we have to understand how the system works. We have to understand that as long as we rely on things we could do ourselves, we have the resources, real resources, we could finance that. So that means that, well, all countries to some extent are dependent from abroad, but there are things you could do to mitigate this dependency. There are choices in terms of real resources you could do to create a prosperity for the majority. That is technically possible. And I think that is the MMT path. The MMT path for me, as I interpret it, is to say that, well, maybe you want to build schools, maybe you want to build hospitals, etc. This is possible. You do not need necessarily to have US dollars for that. If you had real resources, well, you could do it. So let's have a look at real resources. What kind of real resources do we have? You have it domestically. So we could implement those projects based, on issuing the currency. You don't have those resources. How could we use the foreign income, the export earnings in a way that help, let's say, import the technologies we need, the equipment we need, etc. That means the real thing is economic planification of real resources. Once you do that, and once you know how the monetary system works, I think there is a development path which has been underexplored until now by African countries, Global South countries, generally speaking, and also the international development community, because always there is this idea that, well, these countries are poor. And poor is not an adjective that fits that situation, because those countries are resource rich. They have people, creative people, they have the lands, etc. They have some commodities, and all of that could be used. But the colonial system told them that, well, you could mobilize your resources only to the extent that it benefit the metropole or it benefit, foreign countries, not for your domestic accumulation. So people has to change that. And I think in this way of changing things, MMT is paramount.
Yeah, that's brilliant, Ndongo. Exactly. I couldn't agree more in my knowledge of the Global South. If you've got the resources, you can do it. There's an old saying, if you don't want to do something, tell someone you can't afford it. And that will happen all the time in my life, as a school teacher. If the head teacher wouldn't do anything, he wouldn't tell me lots of complicated, I'd love to, can't afford it, when he could, of course. And obviously, as you say, if you've got the real resources, there's nothing to stop you. And the Keynes quote, anything we can do, we can afford to do. And that's really what you're saying. I think that's very, very important. It's great to hear you say that, that if you've got the real resources, you can do it. Obviously, as you say, if you haven't got them, you're going to import them. But then you've got to sell a few exports maybe, and the MMT inside, they're the real costs. And then you can use that exchange to bring in what you like. But you're not relying on it. And being poor just doesn't necessarily mean how many dollars you've got. It's about real resources, and that's great to hear. What you're saying is fantastic there, but is it widely, how widely is it understood? Are there any politicians, any groups in Africa that I could ask that question to and get the same answer as you? Can you cheer the listeners up by saying, yeah, or is it something that very few people know and understand?
I would say it's really the minority, but we are doing efforts. There are colleagues like Fadel Kabok doing a terrific work. Our colleagues at the Tunis office, at the Dakar office, we are trying to make people know how the system works using an MMT lens. And you see, in the African, academic system, well, as everywhere, but it's particularly shocking in Africa, the teaching of economics is, dominated mostly, I would say 99% by neoclassical economics. So it's really tough to be heard, among the academics, because for them it's normal. It's self-referential. They all know that you have to have lower deficits. It's good. Foreign finance does not pose any problem, etc., unless you have, unsustainable debt. All those kind of things. So we are trying to do our best to change the narrative. But the good thing is when you start from the margins, generally, you could be heard probably not by the policymakers or the top academics, but by the real people, because they are looking for alternatives. And the message they receive generally from governments and the mainstream economics ordinarily do not convince them. So when they hear people talking about the monetary system, how it works, etc., this sends a kind of, liberating message. That has been my personal experience with people. Ordinary people, those we say they are illiterate, they know nothing, etc. Whenever you start explaining them simply the principle, they get it and they understand. And I think this is the type of strategy we should have. That means working more with people, grassroots organization, and trying to shift the narrative. And that's what we have been trying to do. That's not an easy job, but this is something we must do, because otherwise, I would say there's no alternative.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in a sense, that's what we're doing, and Ndongo, we're doing exactly the same thing you. The only difference really is it's a bit harder for you, because you've got, if you like, the legacy of colonialism and all the ways that creates this sort of imaginary force that you can't do it for yourself without, the French or the British or the Americans doing it for you. So you've got that plus all the other stuff. We've got all the other stuff, but not that. But I mean, this is more a philosophical question for you, but it seems to me that the legacy of colonialism, this idea of you can't do anything without us, like, the capitalist classes, the colonial powers of the past, it has no doubt a legacy. I might call it a disempowering legacy. And from your experience, if you were trying to put it into words, what is this? Because, like I said, to me, that's your additional challenge. We've got our challenge. You've got that as well. How would you kind of put it into words? And what's the best way that you think to deal with it? And I might argue both from yourself, like someone who's working in the global south, and what about guys like us GIMS people who are in the global north? How can we help you in, if you like, challenging this legacy of colonialism?
Well, one of the manifestations of colonialism beyond its, economic aspects we know of is cultural. It's cultural alienation. That means people are taught to hate themselves in some way. When I say hate themselves, it's not literal word to say that, to devalue what they have, what they are, and to overvalue what comes from abroad. You see, so that has been something you could observe, especially when you look at the behaviors of the elite. The elites are really alienated culturally, and that's why sometimes you could not have a genuine progress of economic transformation with this kind of alienated elite. They are culturally alienated, but they have also their class interest. You see, so that's why you need a kind of, alternative, social bloc that could challenge these types of elites. That means also you need something like a cultural revolution. That is important, and the importance of cultural alienation is visible. It's visible in the trade statistics, in the sense that, for example, in my country we could produce rice. We have the rice. In terms of nutritional quality, it's far better than the rice we are importing from Asia, far better. But we prefer to consume the rice coming from Asia. This has been a colonial legacy, you see. Now we are rice dependent for our daily get, you see. But we prefer to, to spend our foreign exchange to buy the rice from Asia, even when you have food inflation and so on, instead of consuming our local rice. And so this is an aspect. This is an element of cultural alienation. The elites want to buy things coming from abroad. That's why often when you find this analysis of lack of foreign exchange, I have my own reservations. In the post-Keynesian literature, sometimes you see, well, the global South countries, they are short of US dollars, they don't have enough, that's why, sometimes they have to be in austerity, etc. So for me, this kind of argument, well, is superficial to the extent that, well, you could have a stock of, foreign exchange. The thing is, who is entitled to that foreign exchange? What are you using those foreign exchange for? In egalitarian societies, you see, for example, that the foreign exchange, most of it, foreign exchange earnings come from the agricultural producers. They will sell their cocoa, their cotton, etc. But they will not have, decent access to bank loans, for example. But those foreign exchange will be used to buy, luxury imports, to service the repatriation of profits and dividends, etc. So you see, this argument of lacking foreign exchange is not always convincing to me, because it doesn't say anything about how, the limited stock of foreign exchange is used for. So what can be done, in an internationalist, solidarity perspective? I always tend to think that the best form of solidarity is to cut the roots of tyranny domestically. I would say, for example, if there are measures that could harm the global south coming from the global north, our comrades, our friends, our colleagues in the global north should do their best to stop that. That's the best form of solidarity. And I can give an example about trade. The European Union has been pushing for trade agreements with, African countries and global south countries, generally speaking. Because, well, in the European Union model, well, Africa is a kind of a periphery. The future of Europe should be linked, associated closely with the future of Africa. The French Parliament, they once made a report, Africa is the future of France.
Yes.
Not Africa is the future of Africa.
You see.
So that means that, well, for them, it's their ground. And so they were negotiating trade agreements. And most of the economic assessments show that this would destroy agriculture in Africa. This would hamper any attempt at industrialization and so on, But, they push for that. They push for that. And at the same time, you have people saying that, well, it's good to have fair trade. Let's go to the supermarkets to buy fair trade products because we will support, agricultural producers. That's a good thing. But the thing is, at the same time, there were agreements pushed by the European Union Commission that would do much more damage in the African countries, in the global south. So if, for example, movements in the global north could stop that, I think that would be a demonstration of solidarity we expect for. Because generally, there is this idea that in Africa, governments are corrupt, etc., anti-democratic. Sometimes it's true, but the story is much more complicated than that. And the thing is, much of the anti-democratic governments, they are backed by the West. Yeah. And so when our people want to fight those governments, well, they have the support of the West. So if they didn't have the support of the West, we could have taken care of them, easily. Yes. But when they have the support of the West, and also when they have the support of the Western media, it's really difficult to fight them, and also fight, well, other aspects of imperialism, economic imperialism.
We were talking about the effect of like the media and what we get here in Britain particularly, but it's often not clear to us exactly what the situation is. We get more of a simplified view, and it's good that you've put a more nuanced position on that. But yeah, it makes absolute sense that in a world, Africa is seen as like a bit part player in the stage. It's there like the extras in a play. That the EU are the stars, whereas in actual fact, Africa are the stars of their own stage. They're not there as extras in the EU stage. And we need to think about that, because it's quite important for us to understand in the global north the best ways of supporting the global south in more specific sorts of ways. And we know the Western legacy of supporting governments that allow them to enrich themselves goes on for 200 or 300 years or more, maybe a long time. I'm not a historian. And it's just a bit more subtle now. It's not as obvious as it was perhaps when, the British would send out gunboats to countries in Africa or Latin America who apparently owed British banks some money, as they would in the 19th century. But it's fascinating what you said, Ndongo. What I might do is I'll open up to Sarah and to the Gims and see if anyone's got any questions. I know we've been online about an hour now, I think, so I'll let you have a little bit of a break while we see if there's any questions. You know, I've got one or two myself, but I'll let someone else offer a question if they've got one. Clark.
Thanks, Phil. Ndongo, I mean, one of the many problems we have in the global north is that we are expansionist. So capitalism is expansionist. So the global north will turn to Africa, the leaders within Africa, and say, you know, do you want to be part of our club? Yeah. Because it means that your elite will be rich, and we can utilize and exploit the resources, both people and natural resources of your country, which is essentially, I think, what is happening. I get the impression, Phil, we discussed this a little bit earlier, that there are massive geopolitical changes being fought over in Ukraine, with Russia, China sitting relatively passively whilst watching Russia and America and NATO and the West and the developed North fight this proxy geopolitical game, war, whatever you want to call it. So there's big stuff going on at the moment. And I think whilst you talk about, we totally agree with you, you know, the countries within Africa, using an MMT lens, you've got everything you need to make a successful economy and to create wealth and employment for everybody. I'll give you just a quick snapshot. I live in Scotland. We're talking about independence again and becoming an independent country. But I attended a meeting held by one of our political leaders, and they haven't got a clue how to do it. They are still talking about borrowing money off international markets to fund a new country, which is frankly barking and it will not work. But they are the people in power, and they are the ones that believe. And I think there's a strong element of a generation has to die before a new generation can come along and have a chance to bring it that new paradigm that we can see. But it's still a minority view, isn't it? It's just I just wanted to share feel your pain. And you know, I think you are making progress, and we are making progress, but it's painfully slow. And I think, you know, we discussed earlier, you know, somebody like Bill Mitchell turned around and said it won't happen in his lifetime, and I don't think it'll happen in certainly Phil and my lifetime, because we're a bit older. But you never know. You know, I think we said the fall of the Roman Empire came about in over about 10 years. Which is, whilst it's not the same, it's a quantum paradigm shift in geopolitical power within certainly Northern Europe. It was a massive change. And you know, that I'm not advocating revolution. I think you spoke a little bit, Ndongo, about, you know, if the people were more informed, they could stand up. But I'm not sure that they can, because I think the elite still control the military and the police, and they will be frapped down. I'm waiting to see whether we'll get frapped down, Phil, and the ladies from the Gower, whether our phones will get cut off, and you know, our energy will be cut off. So I've really enjoyed hearing about your perspective from Africa. It's been fantastic. So that was just sharing a few thoughts. So I'll shut up now, Phil. Thank you.
No, thanks, Clark. And I don't know if you want to pass a comment, Ndongo, on what Clark said.
Yeah, thank you, Clark, for sharing your thoughts. Yeah, I think we agree on what is happening currently. When I talk about revolution, I use the concept in a way, the way it was defined by the American sociologist Immanuel Wallerstein. He says that, well, revolution is the when the political normality is, I mean, shaken up. For example, before the French Revolution, political normality was that you have a queen, you have the church, etc. You know, you have a kind of a political and social order not based on equality. But after the French Revolution, there was a new normal. And for me, the best form of revolution has to happen, I mean, in a non-violent way, because, well, we all hope that change happen rationally and peacefully, but well, it's naive, we know, it's naive, but we hope so, because violence is always the game of the powerful. So in my own naivety, you know, I try always to say that, well, educating people is the best weapon. And if people are well educated and they unite, I mean, they act in a solidary way between themselves, this will be the powerful way to have the rational change we want. But otherwise it will be a kind of, I mean, absurd change happening because, you know, you have climate change or you have a war, nuclear war, or things like that. So I think sometimes, well, we are naive, but it's a form of naivety, which in fact just reflects, I mean, higher humanistic principles that, well, you could not advocate, I mean, equality, solidarity, and you want violence to keep that, you see, those kind of things. But I think, especially from the perspective of the global south, we have always been told that we lack financial means. So you don't have the money, so you could not develop, you could not have access to decent life. But if ordinary people understand that, well, if you use your imagination, if you use your resource you have available, you don't have financial constraint, I think this is a powerfully liberating message. And that's, for me, one of the most important elements of MMT. And that's what I try to explain to people. At one point, the issue is how you use, I mean, individual creativity, social creativity, because you can have some issues, but you look at the issues and you look at your real resources and you try to find, I mean, solutions to that. I think this is definitely possible. And we could rely also on international solidarity, because I think at one point, the issue is a democratic one in a good sense of the term. That means that people should control, I mean, the major decisions. Ordinary people, they have to organize for that. You know, in the Greek thinking, I like the way they thought, because it was really, I mean, intuitive, in the sense that they had this question: who should govern? And the answer, well, you have multiple answers depending on your claim to govern. If it's an oligarchy, it will say, well, we should govern because we are the rich people. If it's an aristocrat, they will, well, we have to govern because we are a noble family, we have, you know, a long history of nobility, etc. But if it is democracy, you say, well, we are ordinary people, we are the majority, and equality should say that, well, all of us, we should govern, we should have our say. So that means the title to govern, I mean, claimed by democracy is to say that, well, it's equality. We are born equal, and so we have to have our say. And at one point, I think we have to challenge the right to govern of those who currently govern us. Why should they govern us? I think that, well, most of the countries, I mean, the G7 leaders, etc., G8, G20s, those people are not fit to govern us, because they are taking, I mean, decisions that are not good for humanity. So we have to challenge that, I mean, in a peaceful way, to have more democracies, if I could say that.
Yeah, no, I mean, we're all on board with this, Ndongo. I mean, you were getting showing us the passion, which is much appreciated, and absolutely we agree with what you just said. I think I've got, if it's all right with you, chance for one last question from John, and John asks this: what do African countries have to learn from Chinese economic development, if anything? So I don't know what you think about that one, Ndongo.
I think that there have been many lessons we can take from China. And I would frame it around the issue of delinking. Delinking, well, is a concept that has been put forward by Samir Amin, a Franco-Egyptian economist. And by delinking, he meant that, well, you reform I mean, your country in a way that the domestic priorities are more important than the external dictates. That is the linking. That doesn't mean autarky, but that means that you prioritize domestic, priorities, not in a xenophobic or autarkic way, but to say, for example, you have to have the control over the monetary and financial system. You have to have the control over the domestic markets. You have to have control over your raw materials, and you have also to have a control of the technological choices and so on. That is the idea of the linking, and that's what China did successfully for its population. And China also was very clever to limit the degree of proletarianization of its peasantry. Because in many countries of the global south, they took policies that destroyed their peasantry, and at the same time, they didn't have, industries that could absorb, the labor force released by agriculture and so on. You see, and China obviously did not adhere to Washington consensus policies. So there are many lessons in terms of economic development that we can take from China. But the most important lesson is that, well, you could not reproduce what China did, unfortunately, because the context, it's not the same. China is a country, but it's a continent. And they have a political system, highly centralized political system, which probably would not be accepted in many countries currently, you see. So there are some specificities like this that we must take into account. And the most important one is also that, well, if we were all to follow China, and if we were all to follow China plus the Western countries, well, we would destroy the planet, because their economic development has been based on, let's say, net appropriation of resources abroad from the peripheries, etc. Also somehow, developing carbon emissions and so on. So that means that, well, for the past world, there have been interesting things we could learn from China, but for the new world to be created, I think we need a fresh imagination, because creating a post-carbon world, post-capitalist world with equality, freedom and solidarity, we will need fresh imagination, I think.
Thank you, Ndongo. That's brilliant. What I'm going to do is, if you don't, I'm going to mention a little bit about GIMS and other things, and I'll come back to you for a final word, if you've got one for your listeners. So just to mention GIMS, where the GIMS have managed to produce a book. We've got, you may know about this, it's coming out on January 23, chapters from a very wide range of the best MMT economists. Got Neil, Richard and Andrew from Britain, who've been writing on the exchequer and monetary operations. We've got Daniel Kostner talking about the Jeffs plan. And of course, we've got many of the main players. Warren Mosley, the founder, Bill Mitchell, co-founder. Then we've got Randy Raywright, who's also editing. So I could go through all the chapter names, but it's a fantastic book. We're hoping at the GIMS that it's going to be a go-to academic text, a springboard. So keep an eye open for that. It's published by Edward Elgar, coming out. The other thing I'd like to flag up is Christian and Patricia's fantastic MMT podcast, where you've got the major MMT speakers from all over. I'm guessing you've been on that, Ndongo, in the past, and maybe again in the future. I've been fortunate enough to be on that myself. So big shout out for Christian and Patricia. And the other thing about GIMS, we need to be imaginative and be creative, as Ndongo said. We've nearly got to look at new ways of envisaging things, and GIMS are at the forefront. They are pretty inspiring, national treasures. So they need support. So please try and support GIMS if you can. Look at the website, look at the blog, tell people about it. They rely on voluntary donations for their work, which is very important these kind of tricky times. So that's my little heads up to everyone about GIMS and other related activities. To you and Ndongo, it's been absolute delight for me to talk to you. I have learned a lot. I've been inspired. I know that the GIMS have been inspired and the other members of the audience. So, and we're going to try and show a bit of solidarity in the way you said. Is there anything you'd like to leave us with briefly, just as a parting message to GIMS and everyone involved in GIMS and our audience here in Britain?
Well, probably before thanking you, just to inform that we will have the second edition of the African Economic and Monetary Sovereignty Initiative. It will happen in Dakar from October 25th to October 28th. And well, we'll have in Dakar also comrades, people sympathetic to our cause, to our approach. Fadel and others will be there. And the event will also be online. So for people interested to know what is going on in Africa and what kind of alternative thinking we could, promote so as to create policies that are leading to better outcomes for the people. Saying that also, I want to thank you very much for this invitation. It has been a privilege to be here, to have the opportunity to meet you, Phil, and your colleagues, and to have this very enlightening conversation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you then, and I'll say goodbye then. Unless, hang on, I've got a little last question from Sarah, who says, thank you from Claire. She's got one last one, which says, how Warren puts the exporters at the top of the agenda, says, is there any way do you think that Africa can escape the power of exporters? I don't want to leave you on such a tricky note, but where everyone in a country says, the exporters are more important than anyone else.
Could you please repeat the question? I did not.
I was trying to phrase it. It came in. Forgive me. The idea that exporters are seen as the most important people in the country because they generate the foreign exchange, rather than saying, well, exports are a real cost. They might be necessary to fund imports, but they're not the heroes of the party. Are you aware of that? Is anything that you think Africa can do about it?
Yeah, I have followed this discussion about export is a cost while imports are a benefit. And even for heterodox people, this sounds like, crazy when you say that. But from my own perspective, there's nothing controversial in that statement. It depends on how do you want to see it. Because when our president went to Russia to say liberate Ukrainian ports so that we could have access to the cereals, well, so that means that import is a benefit for you. You could see that. You could see that. And when you export also, you take one part of your production, you do not use one part of your resources for abroad. So for me, that is not controversial. The main thing to say is that you have to maximize the terms of trade. That means how many imports you could have for each unit of export. Economically speaking, I think that's the thing. When people say that, well, for the US, we could understand that. Yeah, probably there's some truth in it because the US have the world reserve currency, etc. So imports could be net benefit for them as a nation. Exports could be, a benefit for individual economic agents because in the capitalist system, the corporations look for markets, and when they have access to markets abroad, well, they could have, probably more profits, and so individually speaking, that could be a net benefit. But at the national level, it's a cost for sure. So for me, that is not controversial at all. And the thing in Africa is that the export sector, due to the legacy of colonialism, has always been the driving sector. The driving economic growth and also the pattern of domestic demand. And if you want to have, real economic development, you have to change that. the export has to be just a way of, financing the desired imports, but not necessarily trying to export for the sake of exporting. That is the challenge, because the Western development, even if it profited from colonialism, etc., it has been based on enlarging domestic demand first. So also any kind of, lasting development has to be based on enlarging domestic demand. So export could just be, something, a way of enlarging domestic demand. If it's not played at that role, you stay in the colonial model.
Yeah, thanks. Well, we sneaked a last question in there. Thank you, Sarah, for that. Thanks for another great answer. I'll thank you again for your commitment and for the passion you've shown. We've all enjoyed it. For me, it's flown by. I hope it has for you and Ndongo. And so I'll say many thanks again, and I hope to speak to you again.
Okay, thank you, Phil. Thank you, everybody.